can benefit Canadian and American national interests. We're joined by the Honorable Sergio Marchi, Canada's former Minister of International Trade. Mr. Marchi also served as a Canadian ambassador to the World Trade Organization and president of the Canada-Chinese Business Council. We're then joined by Esfandiar Badmakhalij, the founder of the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, a think tank focused on Iran's economy, and a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We're then pleased to have Scott Jolliffe, the chairperson of the Canada-Arab Business Council, which focuses on promoting trade and investment between Canada and the Arab world. Finally, we're joined by Nizar Ghana, the co-founder and director of research at Triangle, a Beirut-based think tank that conducts research, provides policy guidance, and develops media output on economic, developmental, and social issues in the Middle East. We'll begin this panel with 3 to 4 minutes of opening remarks from each panelist, followed by the discussion. To the audience, if you have any questions, you can submit them during the panel through the Q&A function available on Zoom. Mr. Marchi, let's begin with you for your opening remarks. When you were leading Canada's Ministry of International Trade, you were responsible for Canada's international trade portfolio. Based on your experience, what kind of value do you believe that international trade brings for Canada beyond economic value?
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for their invitation to participate this afternoon. I've always believed that trading relationships build more than just bridges for commerce to travel on, but that it also opens up new bridges between peoples that go far beyond economics. It actually allows us to get to know people and different cultures that in the past may have been either hidden or unknown to us, which obviously facilitates friendships and alliances, which then are able to sustain our trading practices. Trade relationships also can potentially open up some new foreign policy rapports and avenues where we can team up with that country and those peoples in collaborating in non-trade matters, globally speaking. So holding hands and creating alliances on issues that hopefully can better humankind. There's also technology transfers and learning and exchange of new ideas that travel on those bridges. So I believe that a good trading relationships go far beyond just trade, and it actually serves to bring peoples and countries and governments a little closer to one another, which is always something that we need more of.
Thank you. Scott, perhaps let's now turn to you. So Mr. Marchi outlined the value of international trade kind of at the state level, but you have extensive knowledge of how at the local level, diaspora communities can promote trade and business relations between Canada and the MENA region. Beyond benefiting the Canadian economy, are there other ways that such activity by the Arab diaspora community helps to advance Canada's national interests?
Yeah, well, thanks, Nikki. And let me also say thank you for having me today. And I'm honored to have been asked and honored to be able to share with you my thoughts on these important topics. I couldn't agree more with Sergio. Trade is the best gateway to peace and diplomacy, in my view. But on your question about Canada's diaspora, we are very blessed to have many people from the MENA region who have made Canada their home. And but I should also say, before you hear anything else from me, the Canada Arab Business Council is a business-to-business organization. So, of course, I'm going to talk favorably about business between our countries and regions. But our job is to promote and facilitate business connections between Canada and the Arab countries. So there are also many important differences, cultural differences and the like between Canada and Arab businesses. And it's important to recognize that and to respect that. Language is an obvious difference that we all immediately identify with. Although English is the international language in the MENA region, business approaches and relationships are also different. For example, establishing a personal relationship before a business relationship with people in the MENA region is generally much more important in Canada. And of course, there are other differences. There are cultural differences, and not to mention our physical difference. So why do I say that before talking about the diaspora in Canada? Our diaspora from the MENA region is a very important bridge for all of these differences. Canada has people from Lebanon, from Tunisia, from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, from all the countries in the Middle East, and it's natural for those from the MENA region to use their language and cultural and business skills to bridge the differences between Canada and the Arab world. These skills are tremendous assets and invaluable in opening the door for business to the region. So my wish on behalf of the Canada Arab Business Council would be to have more Arab Canadians involved in building the business relationships between Canada and the Arab world.
Thank you, Scott. Esfandiar, let's now turn to you for your opening remarks. The promise of increased trade and economic ties between Iran and the world obviously played a huge role in the initial brokering of the 2015 nuclear deal. And this promise of greater trade and economic ties with Iran still has potential to keep the deal alive today. How far do you think that trade and business diplomacy can go to advance the state's national interests, and what are some of the limitations?
So I think Sergio and Scott have set up my answer really well, because they've outlined exactly the theory that I think a lot of policymakers have about why they would connect initially the deprivation of economic opportunity on a country like Iran to a certain foreign policy outcome, in the case of sanctions connected to the country's nuclear program. And then, of course, the promise that if certain sort of agreements can be reached and concessions are made on both sides, there's this idea that the renewed economic engagement can lead to a sort of more constructive diplomatic relationship. And certainly in the case of, I'd say, the European parties to the nuclear deal, Russia and China, there has been a quite full-throated sort of defense of this idea and this theory that part of the aim of the nuclear deal is to create the conditions by which Iran can re-enter the global economy, and that creates a strong foundation for addressing not only the nuclear challenge, but in the future, potentially other areas of disagreement. I think there's been a little bit of hesitation in sort of the embrace of that idea on the part of the US, which has a much more fraught bilateral relationship with Iran and is ultimately the sort of linchpin of the sanctions regime and the economic kind of containment of Iran that we've seen over the last decade. But ultimately, I'm very optimistic that not only with hopefully the conclusion of the US re-entry into the nuclear deal, but also what appears to be a new kind of regional awareness that diplomacy based on mutual economic interest might offer a way to get around some of the rivalries and the perceived security threats in the region, that sort of the confluence of these two things might see between Iran and the Arab states in the Middle East a kind of a new chapter opening. And so I think the panel discussion we're having now is very timely for exactly that reason.
Thank you, Esfandiar. Nizar, let's move on to you for your opening remarks on a more broader question. I want to ask, what's the prospect for economic growth and development in the region post-pandemic? And how could MENA nations promote sustainable growth and regional trade moving forward?
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I think like my response would definitely build on the other interventions that just came. I think if we're going to speak about trade in the WANA region, like West Asia and North Africa, I think we always have to place it in a structural shift in international trade. I mean, in the MENA region, you see that Asia now accounts about 55% of the region's total trade. And this is like compared to 40%, for example, 1999, I think. So Asia has eaten into the shares of North America and Europe, which basically in 2017, it was 20%. And so there's big questions in the West Asia and North Africa, if West Asia actually is becoming Chinese. Because if we look at UAE's trade, for example, is double that of with America, China. The decrease of trade between generally the Middle East and North America and Europe is an issue actually that has been developing since basically fairly the 1990s and the 2000s. On the level of how, I mean, the MENA region itself, I've worked a bit with ESCWA on actually indexing most of the FDI kind of regulations. And I would say, I mean, definitely the MENA region has tons of problems legally for intra-regional trade, the composition of the economies. But at the same time, I think there is rising forces, Turkey, for example, that is competing currently with UAE, for example, trade with China, if we speak about that, like UAE's drive to get international ports. So trade in many ways is a continuation of politics by other means, or actually trade is politics itself. And I think right now, if we're going to speak about the international trade and MENA region is interlinked, I think, with geopolitical questions. And it's interlinked with what is America's and North America's basically policy towards the region here, which is seen by many as kind of vague currently. Specifically that America is shifting towards the Pacific, right? The Pacific shift. And of course, I believe that as Vandiar was saying, that we do need some form of a détente in the Middle East that could actually also be part of probably North America's drive to restructure international trade. And that could be a beneficial deal. If not, I think where we're going is we're going to become more and more interlinked to the Asian economies as a kind of a drive of a capitalist drive of trade as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. We can, I mean, elaborate a bit more, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to discuss China's role in the region and these topics more in depth during the discussion. Thank you for your opening remarks. You've all made some really interesting points. Mr. Markey, I'd like to turn to you to ask, in your experience, what has Canada's record been in expanding trade opportunities in the region? What role do you see for Canadian trade diplomacy in the region in the future? And as a follow-on question, are there particular opportunities that you think Canada should harness?
I think if one is to be candid, I think the record on behalf of the Canadian government and Canadian business vis-a-vis trade relationships in MENA is rather spotty. I don't think it's a region that has been hotly pursued by either government trade priorities or Canadian businesses. And frankly, one of the reasons, it's unfortunate, but I think it's a reality, is that we are exposed to the region a lot of times with problems rather than opportunities. So many perceptions of the region by Canadian business and Canadians in general is a negative one. We look at the scene today, the very sad, old situation between Israelis and Palestinians obviously doesn't help. So these perceptions imply in the mind of businesses bigger risks and greater instability from a perspective of entrepreneurs. And so it's very easy for those business leaders to look elsewhere because nothing moves faster than $1 million that is frightened. Those dollars will always seek more stable grounds for investing. So we first have to try to change this narrative that people have of the region to say, yes, they have had and continue to have some real challenges, but there's also opportunities to be had. And I think the strategy for following those opportunities has to be a very focused one. We have to pick our spots and provide the rationale for that strategic plan. I don't think we can be, frankly, all things to all people in this region, which means that Canadian businesses and government, frankly, also have to be able to say no to certain aspects in terms of focusing elsewhere. What we also need is that the Canadian government, through its Minister of International Trade, has to signal what her priorities and what her thoughts also are for MENA, so that business can not only follow that, but also plug into her and provide her with business priorities. We've only done 2 free trade agreements, one with Israel and one with Jordan. We have 3 foreign protection agreements with Egypt, Kuwait, and Lebanon. So there's plenty of scope to focus on, both by government and by business. But I think we need to choose the opportunities carefully. We need to make sure that they're compatible with Canadian needs. And then we've got to market with the Canadian business community those opportunities and hopefully bring MENA industry together with Canadian business. But we have to change the channel. We have to change the narrative. Otherwise, I'm afraid that that status quo of underwhelming performance will continue.
Thank you. You've touched on some of the issues like conflict that dissuade businesses from conducting business in the MENA region, but I wanted to ask you, how important is the human rights factor in the decision-making process when it comes to investment and trade with Middle Eastern countries, both at the state level and through companies?
I think human rights, the issue of human rights is obviously very complicated, but very equally important. Complicated because you just can't look at human rights from a MENA perspective. You have to look at human rights from a global perspective, because human rights are human rights are human rights wherever and whomever you speak with. And so we need to have consistency in its application. The reason they are important is because when we export goods and services, we also export our values. We also export what we stand for. And I think we should make those values well known. Traditionally, I have found that doing so behind closed doors is much more effective. I've never shied away from consular files or issues of human rights or detainment of Canadians in those particular areas of whom you're speaking with. And I've been on trade missions with our Prime Minister, who has done equally so. Sometimes we get criticized by the media because we haven't done it in broad daylight. But my experience is that sometimes when you do it openly and poke people publicly, that can make matters worse for the human rights situation or for the individuals that you are trying to address and gain their freedom. So I find that discussions in the meetings themselves can be helpful. I think the other vehicle in more recent trade agreements is to have side agreements that are then built in and integrated to the trade agreement, that are used to address whether it be human rights, labor issues, or environment. So a modern trade agreement can also have these other side agreements, not that they mean less because they're on the side, but they mean to be part of the inclusivity of the discourse that we're having with those countries. And finally, we've all touched on how important the relationship is, because it's one thing to have a good relationship to talk trade. To talk human rights violation, you really have to have a sound friendship and understanding with whom you are speaking so that it gets dealt with in earnest as opposed to swept under the carpet. So it's so crucial to build those relationships if we are to advance the file on human rights.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Scott, I'd like to ask you the next question. Mr. Markey has outlined some of the challenges for Canadian business in the region, but I wanted to ask you, as you currently serve as the chairperson of the Canada Arab Business Council, what key sectors in the region do you think are attractive for Canadian investment, and which sectors do you believe can provide quality goods and services to Canada, despite some of the challenges that the region faces? And lastly, how has your personal experience in facilitating trade and investment between Canada and the region been?
I think
Sorry, Scott, you're on mute.
What would a webinar be without somebody beginning to turn their... I was just saying so many flattering things about the other speakers. Now you're going to miss them. No, I want just a couple of things that Sergio mentioned that I wanted to address. Sometimes we can be arrogant in Canada about our approach to human rights without understanding that we come to where we are with a very different past and different history. And we, as I said earlier, we're blessed with a diversity of people from different regions of the world, religions, ethnic origin, color, race, orientation. But it's not fair for us to be judgmental about other parts of the world, at least without fully understanding the context in which they come to where they are. And, to send out a tweet about the treatment of a woman in Saudi Arabia in public view led to a tremendous disbanding of important business relationships between Canada and Saudi Arabia. So I just, on the human rights side, I think we have to be very cautious about our judgment of others without understanding the shoes in which they walk. Secondly, about our current government, I just was on earlier a call with Minister Ng, and we have a very close relationship with her and what we do. And she recognizes the MENA region as being a very important one in terms of Canada's future international trade growth. With America First policy south of the border and some of the difficulties in relationships with China at the moment, the Middle East looks like a much greater land of opportunity. And I think the MENA region is our 8th largest trading partner. It could easily move up to our 6th or 5th largest trading partner. So let me answer your question directly. It's interesting. I'll talk about some of the different areas in which Canadian and Arab businesses are working together. And, little known to many Canadians is the fact that education as a business was a very early opportunity that Canada took advantage of. There are literally dozens of Canadian educational and training institutions operating in the MENA region. We have thousands of MENA region students attending our colleges and universities and training centers. You might not think of education as business, but it is big business with a very humanitarian purpose, or at least result. That is a lasting result in terms of bringing our cultural and business understanding to a whole new level. Another area of early and continuing involvement between MENA and Canadian institutions is healthcare. That too is an area of business in which Canada is very strong. You may not know that Canada has nursing schools and hospitals and training centers that it operates in the MENA region. The Sick Kids, as anybody in Toronto knows, Sick Kids Hospital is operating or managing a hospital in Qatar. And we also have many Arab students attending our medical schools and doing their medical residency in Canada. So now the opportunities going forward in the healthcare area are all about high tech, artificial intelligence, and research, which Canada is being encouraged to get involved in the region. So another area of early involvement on the part of Canada that is a continuing area of business interest is infrastructure. Not many people realize that 60 years ago, Canada was involved in designing and implementing the water and sewage systems in Riyadh. Canada was also at that time involved in establishing the telecommunications network in Saudi Arabia. And the needs in the region are now as strong as they ever were in countries like Iraq and Lebanon and areas of North Africa. So infrastructure and construction are areas of opportunity where Canada has had tremendous past in its success. Agriculture, of course, is a natural for Canada. We're one of the largest producers of exported agricultural products in the world, both in selling our products and processing food in the region have become very important areas and continue to be in the MENA region. And now, just as with healthcare, agriculture is not only about growing produce or raising farm animals, but agritech. And agritech know-how is something that Canada is a world leader in and has become very important in the region as countries like the UAE and Jordan are looking to convert deserts into productive food producing plants. In fact, a Canadian company I just heard the other day is involved in setting up what will be the largest indoor farm in the world in the middle of the desert in the UAE. So there are many other businesses. High tech is another example, and also our software systems that are used by governments and institutions to manage their affairs. Aerospace has been a big area and continues to be. Transportation, and of course, defense and security. So then you also asked me about products from the region into Canada. And of course, historically, the region has been our largest supplier of dates and olive oil and hummus, as an example. In fact, and another one that not many people will have thought of, Lebanese wines. We just had the Canada Business Council just had a webinar and wine tasting of Lebanese wines, which are world renowned. We've also in Canada benefited from investments in areas like shipping, ports, and of course areas of oil and gas and petrochemicals. So in terms of my personal experience, the opportunities for business, trade, and investment between Canada and the Arab world are at an all-time high. Why? Because probably more than any other regions and peoples, there is a trust of each other and mutual respect that exists. The Canadian brand, including our people, our values, our country, our way of doing business in a very collaborative way compared to a very domineering way that many other countries are known for, gives us a real leg up, and it makes trading and doing business together much easier. And just one final point, another advantage that many Canadians don't realize is the support of our Trade Commissioner Service, which Sergio would know all about. I mean, Global Affairs Canada provides some of the most experienced, knowledgeable, and understanding people to assist Canadian businesses in two-way trade. So I've gone on probably too long, but that's my long answer to your question. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Esfandiar, I'd like to shift gears now back to the question of the nuclear deal. So it seems that Biden will be successful in preserving the agreement, and that nuclear sanctions and at least some Trump-era sanctions on Iran will be lifted. Despite this, businesses will likely be hesitant to re-enter the Iranian market, given the US's withdrawal from the deal in 2018. How can the Iranian diaspora, local Iranian business community, and the US and European governments contribute to upholding the economic benefits that Iran expects from the deal?
So this is a very difficult question to ask in a short amount of to answer in a short amount of time. I think the simple answer is that we have a fundamental problem of statecraft here, where the US has used the tool in the form of secondary sanctions and particularly financialized sanctions that it is finding very difficult to turn off the sanctions when sort of a diplomatic circumstance requires. And, we have a situation where we saw sort of parts of this in the period from 2016 to 2017, where the economic uplift that Iran experienced was significant because there was a resumption in oil exports, there was an increase in trade with key partners, particularly with the European Union, and there was some inbound investment. But there wasn't enough momentum, and certainly not enough momentum, to generate the kind of investment that Iranian stakeholders felt was part and parcel of the agreement, and really that I think most outside observers looking at this issue impartially would feel is necessary to really consolidate the diplomatic agreement or the nuclear deal and the quid pro quo that is in the agreement. So where we are now is that the US is not going to, unfortunately, be very creative or very bold about addressing this problem. It's a structural problem related to sanctions. And I think there is some space for third countries, particularly the countries in the nuclear deal, the European E3, the European Union, Russia and China, but also like-minded countries like hopefully Canada, to sort of encourage the Americans to try and meet the business community halfway, and particularly the banking community, around some of the concerns about re-engaging a market that has been under some form of secondary sanctions for the better part of a decade. Now, adjacent to that, I think one of the things that we could be looking at is it is unlikely that the US is going to do very much for the sake of Iran. But there are ways in which I think the United States could indirectly improve the pathways for trade and investment in Iran in the aftermath of their re-entry into the nuclear deal. And those indirect ways kind of stem from an acknowledgement that I think we need to stop looking at Iran as a discrete economy that exists in a region called the Middle East. And I think what Nizar brought up earlier, which was this idea of a larger West Asia, North Africa space, even expanding beyond that traditional Middle East space, is a much more productive way to look at the pathway forward. And just to sort of wrap up on this idea, and I can certainly expand on it if in the discussion, but I think part of the reason why this would be fruitful is that one of the learnings of the sanctions experience for Iran was the value of regional trade. So Iran found resilience in the face of US sanctions by significantly increasing non-oil trade with Iraq and Afghanistan, two regional countries in which it had a degree of political and cultural affinity, similar to what Scott was describing as being kind of necessary for business to take place. But if you go beyond that, and I think if you sort of buy the idea that Iranian leadership is more aware of the need for regional trade to develop rather than simply sending energy products to far-flung customers like China or France and Germany, then you suddenly have an opportunity to try and make multilateral a lot of the approaches to trade that right now are very bilateral. So, for European countries, for Canada, for other trade partners, when they think about free trade agreements with specific countries, it sort of takes up the oxygen from an effort to try and make trade liberalization a regional phenomenon. And what's really interesting is that all the countries in the Middle East have taken steps towards liberalization for trade because that's something that was necessary to engage with the globalized economy. But they've been very poor at setting up the soft and hard infrastructure so that liberalization would lead more trade intra-region, so between the countries of the region. And I think to the extent that we are trying to think of creative ways that we can encourage more business to take place with Iran, but also to lift all the boats in the region, then what we would want to see is particularly Western countries, and I would count Canada as a key stakeholder, trying to support an effort, a nascent effort maybe in the region, to think about regional economic development in more regional terms. So that's sort of how I would try and connect the dots here about what's happening with Iran as maybe being part of, hopefully, one of the positive steps for a wider rethinking of where growth can come from in the region.
Nikki, can I also add that I think it's a strategic blunder for Canada not to have reopened its embassy. That was under Prime Minister Harper and it continues under Prime Minister Trudeau. And I disagree vehemently with it. I understand the challenges that Iran has posed to the international community, but it's when there's challenges that you need dialogue the most. And by not being present, I don't think we're a player, quite frankly. And secondly, I don't think when Iran joins the rest of the international family, we're going to be first in line. When you consider during the time of the Shah, we had tremendous amount of trade. We had Canada's biggest companies in the Iranian market. And so I was hoping that we would resume diplomatic connections with Iran, because if we're not talking to them, they're not thinking about us, nor will they in the future as easily. And I was in Tehran about 7 years ago, and there's an enormous appetite on the ground by people and companies because they have a wonderful perception of Canada from the old days, the glory days, I guess. And they would much rather deal with Canada than with Russia and China. They're forced to deal with those two because of the sanctions. But if truth be told, what I picked up is they don't really trust either the Chinese or the Russians, and they don't think their products are as good as those in the West. So we're really missing an opportunity by not having a diplomatic voice at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you. Sanjay, I wanted to also ask you another question. In the past year, we've seen notable developments related to regional diplomacy, the ongoing talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accord, the end of the Qatar boycott. What is the state of regional diplomacy among Middle Eastern countries right now? And as a final question, what potential do you think that long-term and comprehensive business and trade diplomacy with Iran could have for regional peace and security?
So I think one of the reasons I'm a little bit optimistic is because we seem to be in a very different position than we were, even a year or two ago. I think one of the main developments, aside from the resumption of some level of diplomatic exchange between Iran and Saudi Arabia, also Iran and the UAE, is the sort of tentative resolution of the GCC crisis. which was, I think, a really important step for making it possible to start to think beyond kind of these regional rivalries. And generally speaking, I would say that, this is going to be a difficult path, but one of the reasons why, and there was a panel earlier today with, and I think Sanam Vakil of Chatham House raised this issue, which is that there's been sort of a realization, I think, in the region that two things are happening. One is that none of the players in the region can successfully leverage the US security guarantee to become a regional hegemon sort of that dominates the others. So to an extent, the UAE tried this, to an extent, Saudi Arabia tried this under MBS. And Iran had its own sort of effort to become the sort of regional power. And the second realization is that, if the US is going to be sort of withdrawing from the region, at least with regards to its security architecture, something needs to replace it. And there is dialogue on sort of all sides sort of agreeing that that architecture needs to be created through a balance that is as Hassan Ahmadian said earlier today, something everyone in the region can live with. But I think where I come at this issue from a more economic standpoint is that it's pretty difficult to get countries that have been at each other's throats to start thinking about collaborative approaches to regional security. One way that you might be able to get there is to help them build trust and understanding and find, the reinforcing incentives through a parallel dialogue on issues of economic integration. And the enabling kind of thing, or the key driver there, is that you also have a situation now where I think countries in the region have realized they need to get this transition away from oil dependence right. And if they don't get it right in the next, basically within the next 5 years, I would say, they're really setting themselves up for being the laggards of global development rather than what they had once envisioned, which was being the leaders because of the enormous wealth. So, to that extent, I think there's a driver because there is this interest in a regional security architecture. There's a driver because there's this need to engineer an economic transition. And both of those seem to, at least to me, suggest, hey, we should figure out a way to actually do business with one another, and those dividends will pay off for these other goals that we need to achieve.
Thank you. Nizar, I'd like to turn to you now. So Esfandiar touched upon the kind of regional hegemony question between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And both countries have, of course, used economic tools and diplomacy to strengthen their influence in certain Middle Eastern states and secure their national interests. What is the aim and role and impact of major regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran in defining foreign direct investment in states like Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, where there is an ongoing proxy conflict for influence? The FDI issue, I think that generally in the region, the FDI that is basically spent mostly by the Gulf, by the GCC countries, it's mainly in real estate. There's little investments in services like in Lebanon. However, while Iran, for example, still supports many, for example, extra paramilitary groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like Hamas, like Iraq, and it's a big problem. In fact, at least for the Levantines, and Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, we are being squashed. In fact, between the big elephants, the Iranians, the Turks, the Gulf. And that is why I agree with Esfandiar in a sense that we need a regional detente, right? We need an agreement maybe between Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, because Egypt is also a big force that could be leveraged as a manufacturer, for example, that could establish then the Levant as a place of trade, because this is what our history was. We are literally like the trilinguals that translate between the Iranians and the Gulf and and the Turks. This is the job, in a sense, historically of Levant. So instead of Syria being a place of war, it would be a place of trade. And then all this money that is we're speaking about billions of dollars coming from oil revenues could be invested in actually some form of regional stability. And in that kind of package, some form of prosperity could be in the pipeline.
I want also to speak a bit, because there's been talks about human rights and how do we deal with human rights. I think it's crucial to understand that there is also an economic. I mean, I might be a structuralist in my perception, but this is the economist in me. That, for example, we have a high concentration of exports in primary commodities, and even high concentration in export markets. We're vulnerable for trade shocks in the Middle East. You know, we export lots of oil and we import everything else, including wheat. So we see that the 2011 the spike in commodity markets led to Arab Spring, and at the same time, there's lots of talk about the lack of reform in the MENA region means that we don't have an independent private sector. I've been to Alberta, to University of Alberta, for a talk a few years ago, to Lethbridge, and I was talking about really the resource curse in the Middle East, and they told me, well, it's the same thing in Alberta. We've been ruled by the same party for years, you know. So that there is a problem. Like when we, and this is back to Scott's argument about like how we deal with the Middle East. We're not, I think, that different. Eventually, structurally, we're, you know, if you have lots of oil, you end up having three people having lots of money, and they spend it all over the place in a rent economy that actually keeps inefficient governments in place. And I think this needs to change. The fabric of the economy needs to change, and this is why I was speaking about also the issue of an international structure of trade. If America and if North America and Europe needs to contain the rise of China and achieve a global balance of power, the WANA region, let's say, will have to take its part. I think this is my hopeful wish, of course, because that would stabilize the region in a sense, diverting, for example, some of the measuring that Europe takes from China to Egypt, for example, that is actually have like 40% unemployment rate. And so we can use most of the FDI that is coming, for example, Saudi Arabia or UAE, all this surplus of trade into investment in Sudan, for example, now, and Egypt, and even Iran, for example, and create some form of an economic prosperity in the region. But I would say that there's lots of problems, though, and I've worked a lot in the investment atmosphere and regulations in the Arab region, and I think mainly what we lack also collective regional strategy. I mean, we are speaking about different regions. The GCC is alone. Levant is literally a war zone. Egypt and Sudan are like underdeveloped, I would say. And you have now Libya in war, and you have basically North Africa alone, having its own thing with Africa, with the sub-Saharan Africa, and also Europe. But I think, for example, Morocco could be an interesting example of how Europe shifted its dependency on gas, for example, natural gas from Russia, to invest in solar energy in Morocco, and with that creating new ways of conducting, you know, economic development. I would say also we have a problem with enforcement and implementation generally. We're like, we have lots of legal exemption, like for targeting military, like in the case of Egypt, but even, I mean, all over the place, even Saudi Arabia. So we have a legal regulatory infrastructure that needs to be developed across the region. Probably more towards regional conglomerates, you know, the Levant alone with GCC, with more North Africa, and then connected with a bigger framework, I would say. I think this would create lots of dividends and would create an economic space that it would also increase international trade and probably increase the trade with North America and Europe, because we'll still need the technology, you know, and we could still produce, for example, oil and manufacturing, and have a kind of a stable, economic development, I would say. So I agree with Asfandyar in a sense that really, like, we need right now a parallel discussion on economic integration, and probably it's already in the pipeline. We already the peace deals with Israel from GCC already creates a zone of economic trade between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Actually, it could go all the way. if of course the Palestinian question is resolved in a just manner that could just open the region up, even including Lebanon and Syria. I mean, that would be the ideal, of course, scenario. Open the trade doors for kind of what the Middle East historically was. Is a mesh. It's a gateway of Africa meeting Europe, meeting Asia, basically.
Thank you. Mr. Markey, I wanted to ask you the next question based on Nizar's comments on the role of China in the region. You've also served as the president of the Canada-China Business Council. So I wanted to ask, how do you differentiate and assess the Chinese approach to business and trade diplomacy vis-a-vis Western countries, including Canada, towards the Middle East? And do different approaches to business and trade diplomacy by China and other states like Russia necessitate some sort of change in Western nations' approach to trade with the region? You're on mute.
Scott's right. Never one Zoom without that. Pardon me. What I was saying is that I had a lot of dealings with China when I was the trade minister, as well as when I went to Geneva as our WTO ambassador after the Chinese joined the WTO in 2001. I made it my business to try to get close and collaborate with their first ambassador, who was a great individual and very, very fond of Canada. But I'm afraid that, and then after public life, I served as president of the Canada-China Business Council, trying to obviously open up trade and investment corridors for our business community, because the Canada-China Business Council had a long and proud and successful history in being a preeminent bridge with the Chinese. But the Chinese, I'm afraid, have changed from the days that I was in public life. That is to say, they were always tough, smart negotiators, no question about it, whether it was with the China bilaterally or with the WTO globally and multilaterally. But there was always a sense that there was a win-win possibility in the outcome. In other words, it wasn't only all about China. Today, I'm finding that the Chinese have become much more belligerent, and they're very much in your face. And Canada has felt that in a very, very significant way. They are now willing to push their weight around, whereas during my days, they were very fond of listening and learning mode and didn't put themselves too far out. This current leadership, I think, has changed that. And so it has made it more difficult for smaller countries who don't have the economic weight and muscle that the Chinese have to negotiate with them, and certainly in a rules-based method. You asked, does that mean that we have to change tax? And I would say yes, if China continues its belligerence, then smaller countries, Canada included, may have to find coalitions within which we can leverage that unity towards our interests and to our ends. We all recall that there was a Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the West, and America was the captain of the Western team. And there were only two sides. You were either on the Soviet side or you were on the Western side. And as we saw, the Western side was fairly united in their sense of purpose. And in the end, they won that battle. They outweighted and outworked and perhaps outfinanced and out-militarized the Soviets, so that the Soviet empire then collapsed. I'm not saying it's the same deal, but I'm saying if that coalition was successful in dealing with the Soviet Union from a geopolitical issue, could we be successful in striking a coalition, probably with America again as the team captain, to deal with China on the economic issues. Some people believe that that might be naive, but I'm not sure that small countries have a great chance with a belligerent China. But I think a belligerent China would be a little more attentive if we're going to meet it with the partnership and the strength of a coalition. I would hope that China changes this way, because years ago, countries were tripping over themselves to get favor with China. And today, increasingly, countries are having a rethink. We see that in Canada, we see that in Australia and New Zealand. The controversy with the pandemic and when we knew what from China, people are now paying attention to that belligerence. And I think it's starting to bite. And so I hope China changes tack. If they don't, we may need to change tack from a coalition leveraging perspective.
Thank you. Scott, now I'd like to turn to you about, you mentioned many opportunities in the region for Canada: agriculture, healthcare, education. And now I want to ask you about renewable energy. In the future, obviously, Middle Eastern states will need to invest in renewable energy and lessen their dependence on oil. How can Western countries like Canada seize this opportunity to promote the green economy? And what Canadian industries can help regional actors move away from fossil fuels?
Well, thanks, Nikki. I can't help but turning to some of the other questions you've asked. And I'm very intrigued with Sergio's answer. And yeah, it's one of the biggest dilemmas that Canada is suffering from is our relationship with China. But like him, I have had a long involvement in history and quite frankly, a very high level of respect. And I find it quite disappointing to see how relationships have deteriorated. But maybe I'm just a little more positive about it than Sergio. I base all of my thoughts on respect for each other. And I think to some extent, the Western world has failed to understand where China is now. And we continue to look at China in the light of its past. And, you know, you can't help but respect the fact that they have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last several decades. And I just think we haven't yet found the right way to interact with each other. And quite frankly, the same problem exists in America with Iran. I think we need a fresh and respectful rethink of all of that. But anyway, you've asked a really interesting question, and I'll harken back to what Nazir was referring to. But you know, the Western world took advantage of the Middle East in terms of its very rich oil and gas resources, as it has, quite frankly, in many other countries around the world, taken advantage of resources, and unfortunately, in most cases, has left the country once the resources depleted with little more than an environmental disaster. Unlike Nazir, I have a more positive view about the way the MENA region, or those countries that are oil rich, have handled their resources and are continuing to handle them. Not to comment at all on how the wealth has been spread or not amongst the citizens of the country. I think there's been a much better management of the oil and gas resources than we've seen in other countries, and maybe even Canada, quite frankly. But the question is, your question is going forward. And first of all, I think you have to start with an understanding that most oil-rich countries in the Middle East appreciate that this is a diminishing resource and their future is not going to be based on that resource. And so what I'm seeing is tremendous movement towards using the revenue from the oil and gas resources to diversify their economies, to build necessary infrastructure to educate their citizens, and as you mentioned, look to other clean resources for their future. Because the truth is that, like the rest of the world, we all have to find other forms of energy for the better of humankind generally, but also because it's a resource that's not going to last forever. So that you're seeing countries like the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and now Egypt, looking to manage the future of their energy and their economies. And they are investing, some obviously more than others, but are investing in new economies. So to your question, where does Canada come in? Well, Canada is a world leader in clean tech. Solar power, for example, we have some of the leading companies in the world. Sky Power is a good example in the development of sustainable energy through solar power, but also other areas that are more relevant in some countries in the Middle East than others, but wind power. I won't go into all the technologies, but we're in a unique position in Canada where we have the technology that we should be using to help countries around the world transition from their oil-based economies through to alternate energy and much cleaner technologies.
Thank you. So we have about 12 minutes left for this panel. I wanted to ask Nizar and Esfandiar a final question. If you can just answer in 60 seconds so that we can leave 10 minutes for the questions from the audience. And it's a big question. It's what would be your recommendation to Western countries for their approach to investment and trade with the Middle Eastern states? Sorry, Esfandiar, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. So, I guess I'll use this opportunity to just mention something on the China issue. I think one piece of advice I would have is, I think the West needs to be very careful about not making its investment case in the Middle East dependent on this idea that they need to counterbalance China. I don't think that's what Sergio or Scott are saying, but I do think that it will be very easy to make that the selling point in Ottawa and Washington and other capitals, basically to say, we need to deepen our economic commitment because we have to counterbalance China. I think the problem there is that it distracts from the actual goal, which should be to, sort of furnish the development and prosperity of the region for its own sake. And two, I don't think it's a particularly compelling pitch for the countries in the region that are already very engaged in trading with China, because China has made this leap as a major industrial partner. So, the politics around the China issue are obviously very complicated. I think we need to be careful about making sure that they don't dominate other sort of areas where, there are very kind of significant incentives and reasons why, for example, we would want to support development in the region.
Thank you. Thank you. Nizar, what's your take?
Yeah, my take, I think that, generally, I think never, I feel like the intervention, historically speaking, in the Middle East was always seen in a cultural lens, either through Orientalism, political Islam, dogmatic. Let's face it, the Middle East historically, with the West, especially Europe, has been, for 1,000 years, has been, with Ottoman Empire, with there's lots of cultural and historical baggage that has been probably as the Buddhists would say, like burned karma. We've burned that karma in the last 100 years. Let's hope that the next 100 years are based on interest, and that means that we need to find common interest. that could stabilize that part of the world, while at the same giving advantage to the West. To the West between two quotations as well. So I would say that this is where we should be going, getting away from ideologues. And I would say that for as well my generation, and I mean this is what we hope after the Arab Spring, that we get out of all this psychosis. For me, like the last 100 years has been 100 years of psychosis, delirium, and to get to a place where we can actually conduct some form of trade with all of the world at an equal footing. And this means that I believe that we have common interests with Europe and with the United States. Mainly, I still believe that United States, Canada, or Europe is still democratic. It's still a place I would live in. So we have some kind of also common cultural base. At the same time, we need technology, and we need to become more developed in manufacturing to stabilize basically the Middle Eastern economies. And I think there is a common interest. So I would definitely argue for a reassessment of foreign affairs, because I don't think currently there is one, of how to conduct a kind of a regional trade / stabilization. And achieve some form of detente, because the Middle East, especially after COVID-19, especially from where I'm living in Beirut, I mean, it's a disaster right here. And so, yeah, I think that there is a strong case for some form of for common interest and agreement.
Thank you so much. So on that positive note, let's move to the questions from the audience. I'd encourage the audience to send any further questions that they have. Let's start with the first one. It's directed to Esfandiar. If the JCPOA is revived and sanctions are removed, which sectors of the Iranian economy do you think will be open to business with the West? And Ahmed, who asked that question, asked another question that says, do you expect Iran to join the international banking system after a possible return to the nuclear deal?
So the answer to that question is that we kind of have an idea from 2016. I mean, in a sense, you will see kind of growth in certainly in the oil sector, at least in regards to kind of who is buying Iranian oil, although investment will remain very difficult. You will have growth in the industrial sector, where you would hope that some of the European multinationals might decide to re-enter, particularly in the automotive sector. But I actually want to go back to sort of Scott's list of best sectors of opportunity in the Middle East, where he highlighted healthcare, education, renewable energy. These were actually some of the sectors, in addition to anything touching sort of the Iranian consumer, that saw the most kind of development in that real sort of immediate period, because they're the sectors where you generally have the lower level of state involvement. There's a larger sort of private sector in manufacturing or in service provision in those sectors. And I think they're also the sectors where the technology transfer and the kind of know-how on offer from countries like Canada or European states is something that Iran is really looking for. So I think we often think about Iran as an oil-based economy. It's not. It's really a consumer economy with an oil sector kind of that offers a little bit of a backbone. And so, when we look at what sectors are going to benefit the most, you want to look at where the consumers are. The final thing I'd say is that all of this is dependent on basically an improvement in the banking sort of situation. And part of that depends on regulatory reform in Iran, including FATF. I think that if the nuclear deal, goes according to plan, we will see the FATF issue see progress in Iran, because there is some emerging consensus that they just have to get off the blacklist if they're going to have any normal banking with any of the main trade partners. But that's a much longer sort of project, getting the banking system reconnected to the global banking system.
Thank you. The next question is from Ben. It's directed to Sergio and Scott. Do you think that right now Canada has a solid strategy to diversify its trade, including expanding its trade with the Middle East? Scott, let's begin with you.
I should have started with Sergio, but yeah, well,
Over to you.
I don't want to be critical of our government, but I have to say we could have a more developed, focused strategy for international trade. At the moment, I think we're tending to look a little closer to home, to our small, medium-sized businesses and helping them develop, women and Indigenous-led businesses, and that's all very important. But I think we do need to focus on where our best opportunities are. And, I come at this with a clear bias, which I've mentioned throughout this, but in my view, the Middle East, the Arab world, provides the best opportunity for growth at this particular point in time. And I think we probably could, as a nation, through our government, have a more focused strategy in how to do that. Now, let me say that the government has invested in Expo 2020 with this purpose in mind. And I know for countries outside the UAE, Expo 2020 is looking like a UAE extravaganza, but that's not the way we look at it. We look at this as being a hub opportunity for Canada to interact with the entire region. And my hat goes off to the Canadian government for making the decision to participate in Expo 2020, getting behind it in an amazing pavilion, and providing all of the global affairs support to turn that into a real commercial opportunity between Canada and the whole region. So, Ben, I probably haven't answered your question directly. Let me try to. I think we could use a better, more defined strategy than we currently have.
I think Canada has been trying to diversify trade for many, many years. And the problem is when you sit beside the superpower in the largest economy, it's tough. And they speak one of our official languages. It's so easy for Canadian business to dip their toes in American waters first and foremost. But I think during the 4 years of the Trump regime, I think that really focused the Canadian government. We saw a European trade agreement. We saw an agreement with Korea. So in other words, now that during the Trump time, they were getting particularly tough, and we saw other countries penetrate that market just as well as Canada. It's pushed us to diversify. I'm removed from, obviously, government these days, but my sense is that it hasn't worked out a strategic plan yet for MENA. They may be in a similar situation as Canadians are, looking at these perceptional problems. But I think the idea and the answer is to focus like a laser. The ability to say no will also bring the ability to say yes, and have that matched with Canadian business interests. On the Iranian question, if I may, when I was in Tehran, I certainly picked up two areas where they were looking to Canada. One was infrastructure and engineering. We used to be in that market big time. We are no longer there. And Tehran, a great place, great culture, but it looks fatigued. In other words, the buildings are worn out. I was staying at a hotel that they said was a 5-star, but it was really, to be generous, a 2-star. So there was a fatigue in their infrastructure. Secondly, they made a specific point of saying, while different places, because of war, have ruined their tourist and cultural treasures, like in Iraq, Iran has an abundance of treasures all over the country, but what they need are regional aircraft so that tourists can get beyond Tehran. And their aircraft are old. There was also some cases where they had to stop flying because the parts were, again, worn. And so if you talk about a company like Bombardier, there would be terrific opportunities for the regional aircraft market. So, but like I said, we first have to dialogue and then do business. And if we don't do the first, it'll be tougher for our business to do the things that they can do, because other countries may be given the preference who may have continued that dialogue while we have been rather silent.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of time for this panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists for all of your insightful comments.
Sir,
Yeah.
Nikki, if I may, you missed
Sure.
one question, and you missed one question. I understand why, from Roxana about human rights violations in Israel, and I'm not going to answer the question. All I can say is my heart goes out to the citizens of Palestine and Gaza. We in Canada really wish for a resolution of this. And I don't think it's up to me or us to castigate her. But my heart goes out to the citizens who are badly affected by this, and I hope for an early solution. So sorry, Nikki, I thought Roxana deserved an answer.
Yeah, no, it was just because we'd come to time. I would have asked that after, but thank you. So thank you all again. I'd like to also invite the audience to the next panel, which will begin at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. So that's in about 13 minutes, on pathways to managing nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East. Thank you again. Take care.
Thank you all.